B92. Serbia calling.
The Magnificent!
Serbia calling.
In 1995, the charity War Child released an album called Help. It featured some of the biggest and best artists of the time, including, amongst others, Oasis, Radiohead, Sinead O'Connor, the KLF, the Charlatans, Blur, Portishead, Nana Cherry and Paul Weller.
Come together right now over me.
It raised £1.25 million, and the proceeds went to help thousands of children caught up in the Bosnian conflict.
We've all the will in the world. Typing Portishead.
The album itself was incredibly all recorded in a single day and released just a week later.
Raindrops keep falling on my head, just like the guy whose feet are too big for his bed.
This September 2020 marks the 25th anniversary of Help, and the album is being re-released for the very first time on vinyl and on streaming platforms, so everyone can hear this remarkable collection of songs. But getting huge stars to record 20 songs in a day and then releasing them in a week wasn't easy, and there's an amazing story to be told about how it happened. That story includes car crashes, private jets, Tony Blair, Johnny Depp, John Lennon, and a pregnant bear.
It's getting late now. He knows today that he will surely die.
So here then in this podcast, with a bit of help from people like Paul Weller and members of Radiohead, the Manic, Salad, the Charlatans and Blur, plus many of the people from behind the scenes, will tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth about the making of the greatest charity album of all time.
Today, Billy Joe McAllister jumped off the Tallahatchie Bridge.
My name is Matt Everett, and this is Help, the story of the War Child album. Episode 1, The Idea. Between 1992 and 1995, a ferocious civil war raged in the former Yugoslavia. As is often the way with modern conflict, it's incredibly hard to explain or even understand why countries tear themselves apart. It's even harder to understand when it happens virtually on your own doorstep. Being a mere 2-hour flight from the UK, Yugoslavia was a popular holiday destination. The people, not unlike us. They had money, jobs, families. They drove nice cars and lived in nice houses. A war in Yugoslavia was kind of like the English rolling tanks into Wales. Almost unthinkable. Almost. War Child CEO Rob Williams.
The causes of the Bosnian conflict go way back to Yugoslavia, which was a construct after the Second World War, put together lots of countries that had been independent states. And as the Iron Curtain fell and the Cold War came to an end, those individual countries were agitating for their own independence. And that conflict, which apparently would be quite straightforward, got mixed up with religious division. So it became sectarian. People who were either Muslim or Christian, who you might expect to fight on the same side for independence, began to fight each other according to their religious identity. So it became a very, very vicious war, largely between militia who identified as Christians and militia who identified as Muslims. The whole region is very mixed, but it was a tinderbox then for all kinds of small militia leaders to gather around themselves a bunch of followers and radicalize them. So what singles out Bosnia for me was A, it was on the telly a lot. People could see what was happening. And B, because it was sectarian, it was very vicious. Like the rules of conflict where people fight over territory were thrown out of the window. And people were doing whatever they could to demoralize and terrorize the other side. So in Srebrenica, you get massacres of young Muslims. In Sarajevo, you get children being shot at by snipers. Not because they wanted to kill the children, but because they wanted to absolutely terrify the civilians, the parents who were still trying to live in Sarajevo. The way to move a population quickest is to convince them that if they stay there, their children are going to die. So children become the primary targets.
But some people were finding out more about the conflict, and it was having an impact on them.
My name is Tony Crean. Back in 1995, I worked at a record label called Go Discs. Around that time, I moved from being head of marketing to being head of international, having been a press officer before, and I was a sort of head of press at Go Discs, which was a small independent record label of about 15 people at the time.
Tony now works in music management, looking after the Chemical Brothers, amongst others. But as he says, in July 95, he worked at a record label. Go Discs were home to Beats International, The Beautiful South, Paul Weller and Portishead. And Tony was laid up in bed with a dose of the flu.
I had a couple of days off with a sort of combination of summer flu and possible hangover or something like that. But no, it was some sort of summer flu bug that knocked me out for a couple of days. And so I stayed indoors and I watched the telly. I hadn't really paid that much attention to the news in the previous couple of years, maybe. I mean, it had been in the back of my mind. And I'd always been interested in politics. I'd always been interested in the news. I'd grown up specifically, really, grown up reading the music press during the 1980s. Music papers like The Enemy were very good in covering everything from sort of like post-punk, sort of rock against racism to the People's March for Jobs, the miners' strike, obviously, the fight for the right to work in the 1980s during the recession and under the Thatcher government. So things like that, which were really important at the time to me and to my friends and to the society we grew up in.
The TV news showed that the fighting in and around Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia, was reaching its height. The inter-ethnic conflict had taken the lives of 250,000 people and displaced a further 2 million. Those fleeing the bloodshed, men, women and children, were left with nothing. Tony.
I found myself quite shocked to see both what was going on, just how bad things had got in Bosnia and the whole of the former Yugoslavia, and how little I really knew about it. The massacre of Srebrenica in July 1995, it was so shocking. It put those events very, very firmly back on the front pages, and it put the events very firmly back into people's consciousness. In the village of Srebrenica, there was a United Nations compound, and there was a large amount of predominantly Bosnian Muslim refugees who'd taken refuge under the protection of the United Nations forces. But it was only a very small group of, I think, Dutch United Nations troops. And basically the Bosnian Serbs sort of walked in and took away. The United Nations Protection Force wasn't able, for whatever reason, was not able to protect, to stop the Bosnian Serbs coming in and effectively taking away all of the men and young boys from that area. Up to about 8,000 people were massacred, and probably, I think, what's been termed the biggest act of genocide since the Second World War.
When he returned to work, Tony couldn't stop thinking about what could be done to help those facing a kind of disaster that he couldn't even imagine.
It was a conflict which the United Nations and the European Union had effectively, and NATO, I suppose, had stayed out of, because obviously this was coming after the breakup of the Soviet Union, it was coming after the fall of the Berlin Wall, it was the breakup of Yugoslavia. The term ethnic cleansing came up again and again, and it was one of those things where if you didn't take the time to necessarily read into what was going on, it was not easy necessarily to find out what were the causes behind this, and who was there's never any black and white in these situations, but who was, basically why these people were fighting and why these atrocities were happening.
Ben Knowles is a former director of music at War Child.
I mean, the war in Yugoslavia was one of the most hideous and unimaginable human crises that Europe's had faced, certainly the biggest since the Second World War. But it was largely going unreported in the British media, and certainly British politicians weren't being held to account by the public, by the media, or by the celebrities in the way that we expect them to do nowadays. This was the days before social media. This was a huge embarrassment, I think, a huge shame to this country, in that people hadn't responded in the way they should. People hadn't demanded action. People hadn't shouted that this was a human rights issue. This was a humanitarian crisis on our doorstep in mainland Europe that nothing was being done about. I think if you focus on a conflict like this through the lens of the innocent children that are the victims of this, it's an incredibly powerful way of making it something that is impossible to ignore.
And I felt incredibly guilty as a person who'd always had a very, I felt I'd had a pretty decent social conscience and a strong awareness of things like that I hadn't really paid enough attention. So all I did then was I started talking to people, my friends and stuff. We were out a lot in those days. You saw a lot of people out in very, sort of small clubs and bars and stuff like that. It was often, there was a lovely sort of collective spirit to the sort of music industry and the people around the music industry at the time, because it was a good laugh. And so I just sort of started bringing the subject up to people, in the midst of everybody else talking about music and good times, which I just sort of thought, well, the least I can do is just sort of throw it into the conversation.
I'm Terry Hall. I was the owner of Hall or Nothing PR from the 90s through to very recently. And among our acts at the time that I PR'd were the Manic Street Preachers, TerrorVision, the Stone Roses, and many others besides.
So Tony Crean started speaking to people like Terry.
That's the bit I remember most vividly, actually. He called to say he'd been off with flu, and he was reading the newspapers. And in Tony's funny way, he was like, not just the back pages, Terry. So he was reading the whole of the paper and just becoming more distressed and more alarmed by what was going on over the water in a country that probably some of us had holidayed in. And he called me at Hall or Nothing and said, look, we should do a concert. We should do something. And the urgency in his voice was like, wow, we should.
There was a quote from a charity worker on television at the time who said, we need £200,000 to feed and clothe these children. And it's £200,000 we haven't got. And Tony starts thinking if everyone who read The Melody Maker and The NME gave a quid, that would do it. And at a Black Grape gig at the Hanover Grand in London, Tony bumps into the band's PR, Anton Brooks, another music industry legend who looked after Nirvana, amongst others. Anton talked to the band that night about doing something, and they said yes. A phone call later, and the Stone Roses agreed to help out as well. The initial idea was maybe a concert, the Stone Roses and Black Grape, and a load of other big names. Terry Hall.
For some reason, availability, it just couldn't be done with pulling that many acts in physically to do a gig within a few months. So I went back to Tony and said, look, I don't think a gig is going to happen. But my background was sort of A&R, sort of recording and producers. And I was like, I could help you put a record together. I do know about that. And I guess with Band-Aid in mind, I guess that was sort of what I was thinking of. And then it developed from there into, let's get every act to do something.
The conversations started to gather pace. Tony Crean.
And the more times I raised it in conversation with people, the more people came back to me. Lots and lots of people were saying exactly the same thing. They were all shocked. They all felt something needed. Would it be possible to do anything? And I thought, well, I thought it was one of those things. I thought, well, if you throw enough pebbles into a pond, maybe something like maybe you can start a couple of ripples, and somebody will come up with an idea, and something might be able to happen if you just keep spreading it around. It was definitely not like just my idea or my initiative or my energy or anything like that. It came from a huge amount of people. That collective spirit, I think, was very important right from the start. And this was even before we made contact with War Child. I had a good friend at the time, Grant Fleming, who's a photographer, who'd done a lot of work with Primal Scream. And Grant's a good socialist. And me and Grant went to quite a lot of meetings with all sorts of different people, including a very, very moving meeting of Bosnian refugees in Westminster Central Hall, which was a very, I think that was probably the moment when I just thought, they really got to do something here, because there's suffering going on under our noses.
Rob, Anton and Terry realised that between them they knew every British rock and dance act worth their salt. With Black Grape and the Roses on board, maybe other acts would help out. Maybe they could put together a single. So Tony, Rob, Anton and Terry started to trawl through their legendary contact books and started thinking. Now, there had been big moments when music and charity had come together in the past, obviously. But in the mid-90s, the scene, the egos, the infighting, loaded culture, maybe all that didn't sit too well with talking overtly about charity work. But for many bands, that ethos was still there. Ed O'Brien from Radiohead.
I mean, we're all of that same era, most of us, and things like Live Aid, certainly for me, Live Aid was a huge moment in the power of music. And of course, you know, you can argue about its longevity and how much it made a difference. But I certainly grew up in the 80s, you know, as a teenager, being really aware of the power of music and how it could bring people together, how it could shine a light on things. And I think probably the hedonism, you know, the whole criminal justice bill and what happened with, you know, the rave scene, it sort of went more underground, I guess. But, you know, I guess it was in the middle of, and that was a very hedonistic affair. But having, you know, Radiohead weren't a part of that. We were never down the good mixers. So I think we were, you know, it felt a very natural fit for us.
However, it's fair to say that in nearly all the cases where music and charity met, the good intent far outweighed the creative end result. Dave Rowntree from Blur.
Yes, I think that is a fair summary, and we've done a lot of these. It was most common, I think, for kind of indie bands like us in the very early 90s, because at the time, I mean, before the kind of Blur and Oasis and Parklife and all of that kind of stuff, indie bands couldn't get arrested. You know, we had our own chart because we were that unpopular. And the music was that unfashionable. So, you know, they used to bung a dozen of us on a charity album in the hope that we were past the celebrity threshold and somebody would be interested and somebody would buy it. So we'd done a fair few of these, and they would often involve recording doing covers of tracks by a particular artist or something, you know.
But this was going to be different. And it had to be immediate. Events were becoming increasingly desperate in Bosnia. Ethnic cleansing, mass slaughter of civilians, cities under siege. Everyone knew that if they were going to do anything, they had to do it fast, right now, reflecting that urgency. Looking for the best way he could help, Tony Crean remembered a call he'd had from War Child and started attending meetings with them. During one such meeting, also attended by the legendary PR Rob Partridge, Tony came up with the start of an idea.
And so we were at this meeting and I sort of said, oh, well, I think if you're going to do anything, you know, you've got to take advantage of the situation. It'd be great if you could get Blur and Oasis on the same record. And I said, and it's got to be done quickly. And I said, I've got no idea how you do this, but I know that sometime years ago, I read in the NME that Toots and the Maytals playing a gig on a Friday or a Saturday, and somehow they had a record in the shops by Monday. So it's possible, but I've got no idea how you do it. And then the fella next to me turns to me and says, I know how they did that. I worked on that record. And that was Rob Partridge. And I think that was the moment really when I sort of thought, oh, actually, you know.
Incidentally, I've seen Tony do this in the making of this podcast and the re-release campaign. I've sat in meetings with Tony and everyone's been talking for hours. And then right at the end of the meeting, Tony comes up with the most astonishing idea. This is kind of what he does. And he's a pretty inspirational character. Here's Ben Knowles.
Tony, I met for the first time around the Help album, and he's just a total bundle of energy and impatience and ideas, and a total inspiration. And the album would not have happened without his initial idea, his tenacity. He's like a dog with a bone when he has an idea, and this was the first of many things he did with War Child. But yeah, an incredible chap, and I'm very pleased he gets recognition for the legacy of what he created, not just with Help, but with the ability that War Child had for the decades since to build that incredible relationship it has with music.
Our idea was to say, well, let's record, and then it developed into an album. I mean, I was thinking we'd do a sort of Band-Aid type single. When Tony comes back with the ambition of, no, let's do a whole album.
Now, the late, great music PR Rob Partridge is involved, something of a legend in the industry.
And Rob was just one of those very, very, very special people who was a magician. He could make things happen. It was almost like he knew, because he'd been there and done it so many times. He'd been, he'd worked head of press at Island Records in the 70s. He'd been Bob Marley's press officer. He played footy with Bob Marley. I think he was a man that really discovered U2, sort of thing. You couldn't find a man with more respect or more contacts. He always, I know somebody who could help us with that. He was one of those people. You couldn't think of a better person. And he was obviously, he'd been involved with War Child for quite some time. He had a very, very good sense of what could turn a news, get into a news headline as well, make a bit of a story.
So releasing an album in 1 week. Toots and the Maytals may have done it, but it turns out that music gods were looking down and gave their blessing and that final bit of inspiration. Tony.
It must have been just that week or a couple of weeks after. I was chatting to a journalist called Paolo Hewitt, who used to do quite a lot of work with Paul Weller at the time, and I said, we're going to try and make a record in a day and get it out, as quickly as possible. And he just said, that was John Lennon's idea. And I was just like, what do you mean? He said, that's instant karma. I said, what are you talking about? He said, well, that's what Lennon said instant karma should be. You should record on a Monday, mix it on a Tuesday, produce it on a Wednesday, just get it out. And it should be out like a newspaper. It should be out by the end of the week. I was like, can you just repeat that, please? I can't believe this, because I knew the record, I knew Lennon's instant karma, but I had never heard that. Suddenly, it was like, you ask about a blueprint, but that was it. It was like we'd just been gifted this blueprint.
Like a newspaper, an immediate response to what was happening. All the artists being asked to be involved were committed to helping the cause and fascinated by the idea. Tim Burgess from the Charlatans.
I remember Goldiscs getting it all together and being approached, just through the lines of communication that, you normally get approached about something. And it was to do with Bosnia. And it was very scary what was going on, and everybody knew about that. But this was a record, and, all these names were mentioned, and it just felt like a really great idea. It was kind of at the height of Britpop, or, around Britpop, and everyone was John Lennon obsessed. So it was like, let's do something like Instant Karma, where you kind of record something and you put it out immediately.
Paul Weller.
I think Tony's idea came from something that Lennon had said, where he thought that records could be like newspapers, that you could just put one out every week or every few weeks with whatever you wanted to say on it. And so we kind of took that as the kind of premise for getting the record together, and doing it that quickly as well.
So here we are. The idea was, to paraphrase a rumour of what Lennon was supposed to have said, the best record you can make is recorded on a Monday, cut on Tuesday, pressed up on Wednesday, packaged on Thursday, distributed on Friday, and in the shops on Saturday. That might not be an accurate quote, but that was the intent behind Instant Karma. Lennon wrote it on the 27th of January 1970 and recorded it the same day, and it was released on February the 6th, 10 days later. Our intrepid team wanted to do it in 7, but they had the idea, capital T, capital I, and as ideas go, it fitted the brief rather nicely. But in 1995, this was a considerable challenge. This was a great concept. No one had ever done it before on this scale, but there's a reason for that. Terry Hall.
I can't stress enough how hard it was back then to do what we did with Godis, with Andy McDonald, with everybody who came on board. Because if you're a kid listening to this now, you'll go, mate, I can record in my bedroom tonight and put a record up tomorrow. But then it just did. I mean, if you can overstress that, then please do, because it was such, unprecedented is a word we're using a lot right now, but it was completely unprecedented.
And this was a good story. There was a great cause. It involved this new generation of musicians who were big, big stars, and a considerable challenge. Ben Knowles.
Back in 1995, I was a 21-year-old reporter on the Daily Mirror. I was pretty much its Britpop correspondent. I was the only person there who could tell Oasis and Blur apart. And Terry Hall, legendary music PR for everybody from the Stone Roses to Manic Street Preachers, gave me a call and said, we're trying to put this record together, and it's ambitious. We're trying to bring together the best of British music in 1995, which was one of the best years for British music on record, to record an album in 24 hours. Immediately was the most newsworthy of propositions, and at the time, back in the mid-90s, the Daily Mirror was still a very left-wing campaigning newspaper, and was one of the few newspapers where there's a brilliant journalist called Roswyn Jones who was reporting on the terrible humanitarian crisis that was taking place in the former Yugoslavia. So those two things together had huge appeal to us. So I immediately went and knocked on the door of my editor, which was Piers Morgan, and said, look, this is what's happening. I think we should get on board. And the Daily Mirror became the media partner on the campaign, which was brilliant for the profile of the album, I hope. But from a personal perspective, it meant that on the day of the recording, I was there at Abbey Road and was there up at Church Studios and had the great pleasure of seeing firsthand the gestation and the delivery of this incredible project.
So there is the plan. This plan involves releasing the album on a Saturday and celebrating its #1 status on Sunday, making it the fastest album ever recorded. It also potentially solves the problem of how to raise a shed load of money for War Child almost overnight, if everything goes according to plan. That's a very big if. How do you get some of the biggest acts in the UK to record a whole record on one day and release it into shops physically a few days later? And what exactly is War Child? Where did it come from? What do they do? And why are we talking about them? I will endeavour to answer all those questions in part 2 of Help, the making of the first War Child album. Since the Help album was first released in 1995, support from music fans has enabled War Child to reach millions of children whose lives have been torn apart by conflict. Today, with the added threat of coronavirus, War Child's work is more important than ever. You can help them and be there for more children and their families by making a donation today. Please do this. Find out more at warchild.org/help25. That's warchild.org/help25. Go there. Get involved. This has been a Cup and Nuzzle production for War Child. There's a lot of people to thank, so I think we're going to do that at the end of this whole series. Also, because we're still doing interviews for this and we're nowhere near finished. But until then, I'll see you for episode 2. I've been Matt Everett. Thanks for listening.